I didn't know my daughter-in-law could laugh at a funeral until she heard my name in my husband's will. Vanessa's laugh wasn't loud. That was what made it worse. It slipped out of her like a reflex, a small sound, barely more than a breath. But in the silence of Arthur Bennett's law office, it landed like a slap. I looked up from the pair of black gloves folded neatly in my lap and saw her leaning back in her chair beside my son, Daniel, smiling as though someone had just shared a private joke. My husband had been dead for 9 days. 9 days. 9 days since I stood beside Richard Holloway's walnut casket and listened to people tell me what a remarkable man he had been. A visionary, a businessman, a community leader. None of them mentioned the man who warmed my side of the bed every winter for 42 years. None of them mentioned the man who still left little notes beside my breakfast plate because he knew I liked finding them. None of them mentioned the man who never forgot how I took my tea. I suppose strangers only remember the version of you that belongs to them. The rain tapped softly against the office windows overlooking downtown Hartford. Nobody spoke. Even Arthur looked uncomfortable. Vanessa quickly straightened her expression. "Sorry," she said with a little shrug. Richard always had a sense of humor. Humor. Interesting choice of words. My husband had been buried less than 2 weeks. Daniel stared down at the conference table. At 41 years old, my son still reacted to conflict the same way he had at 12. Silence. Avoidance. Hope it would disappear on its own. Arthur adjusted his glasses. As I was saying, he continued carefully, the primary residence in Westport shall remain under the ownership of Margaret Holloway. Vanessa's smile vanished for half a second, then returned. Smaller. Sharper. Well, she said, crossing her legs, that's probably temporary. Arthur didn't answer. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and old paper. Richard had chosen this law firm almost 30 years earlier because he believed serious matters deserved serious places. Dark wood. Quiet voices. No nonsense. I remembered teasing him about it once. If you ever become president, I told him, you'll probably hold cabinet meetings in a library. He laughed. No. Libraries are for people who still want to learn. The memory hit harder than I expected. For a moment, I had to focus on breathing. Arthur continued reading. Trusts. Investments. Charitable donations. The details blurred together. Not because they were unimportant. Because none of it mattered. Not really. The only thing I wanted was sitting in a cemetery overlooking Long Island Sound. Then Arthur stopped speaking. The room grew still. He frowned slightly while flipping through several pages. Vanessa immediately looked up. What is it? Arthur studied the file. It appears there is an additional instruction referenced here. Daniel finally raised his head. What kind of instruction? Arthur hesitated, then looked directly at me. A private document left by Richard. Something tightened inside my chest. Vanessa shifted in her seat. A private document? Yes. Arthur folded his hands. According to these notes, Richard requested that it be reviewed if certain concerns about family conduct proved justified. Nobody spoke. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the city. Vanessa laughed again. This time the sound felt thinner. Concerns? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the file. Mrs. Holloway, he said gently, your husband may have anticipated more than the distribution of his estate. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. I don't remember most of it. Grief has a way of swallowing details. By the time we stepped outside, the rain had stopped. Daniel offered to drive me home. I declined. He looked relieved. That hurt more than I expected. The drive back to Westport took nearly an hour. I passed places Richard and I had visited together for decades. The bakery where he insisted on buying cinnamon rolls every Sunday. The little bookstore where he'd disappear for 45 minutes and emerge carrying 3 books he didn't need. The coffee shop where he proposed to me after pretending he'd forgotten our anniversary. Every corner carried him. Every street held a memory. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. The house stood exactly where it always had. White brick. Black shutters. 3 stories filled with 42 years of marriage. Yet it already felt different. Loss changes architecture. Rooms seem larger. Hallways become quieter. Silence settles into furniture like dust. I sat in the car for several minutes before finally going inside. The first thing I noticed was a stack of renovation catalogs on the entry table. Kitchen remodels, designer lighting, luxury flooring. I stared at them. Richard hadn't even been gone 2 weeks. Not 2 months. Not 2 years. 2 weeks. I quietly picked up the catalogs and placed them inside a drawer. Then I walked into the living room. Richard's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. The sight nearly undid me. Every evening for 20 years, he'd sat there reading while pretending not to watch whatever television show I happened to choose. I touched the glasses gently, then left them exactly where they were. Some things deserve to stay untouched. Upstairs, I heard voices. Vanessa. And someone else. I climbed the staircase slowly. The voices grew clearer. "The room feels dated," Vanessa was saying. A woman laughed politely. "I suppose that's one way to look at it." I stopped at the doorway of the dining room. Vanessa stood beside a young interior designer. Fabric samples covered the table. Color swatches. Flooring samples. Lighting sketches. The same dining room Richard spent 6 months restoring for our 25th anniversary. The same room where Daniel blew out birthday candles every year growing up. The same room where we celebrated promotions, graduations, Christmas mornings, and anniversaries. Vanessa turned. "Margaret." Her smile appeared instantly. "We were just brainstorming." The designer suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Good. At least someone did." I glanced around the room. At the mahogany table, the crystal cabinet, the wedding photograph hanging above the fireplace. Every object held a memory. Vanessa folded her arms. "I think the room needs to feel lighter." "Lighter?" I asked. "Yes." She smiled. "Less formal. Less old." Old. There it was. Not the room. Not the furniture. Not the decor. Me. The room reminded her of me. Of Richard. Of history. Of everything standing between her and whatever future she imagined. The designer lowered her eyes. "Smart woman." I smiled politely. Richard loved this room. Vanessa's expression tightened for the briefest moment. "Well," she said softly, "people hold onto things longer than they should." I nodded, then left. No argument. No confrontation. No tears. Just silence. Because something had begun bothering me. Not the catalogs. Not the decorator. Not even the laugh at the will reading. Something else. A feeling. Small. Persistent. Like a loose thread. I carried that feeling into the kitchen. Into the evening. Into the lonely dinner I ate by myself. And into Richard's study after dark. The room smelled exactly as it always had. Old books. Leather. Cedar. His fountain pen still rested beside a stack of unopened mail. His blue mug sat near the lamp. The same chipped mug he'd used every morning for 15 years. I picked it up, ran my thumb across the crack near the handle, then sat down in his chair. Outside, the garden glowed softly beneath landscape lights. The hydrangeas were beginning to bloom. Richard loved hydrangeas. He said they looked hopeful. I wasn't feeling hopeful. I was feeling something else. Confused. Uneasy. Like I had missed something important. Then my phone rang. Arthur Bennett. I answered immediately. "Margaret." His voice sounded different. Lower. More cautious. "I'm sorry to call this late. Is something wrong?" Silence. Paper shuffled faintly on his end. Then he spoke. "Your husband left instructions for me if today's meeting unfolded a certain way." I sat up straighter. "What kind of instructions?" Arthur exhaled slowly. The kind that suggest Richard was worried. My stomach tightened. Worried about what? Another pause. Longer this time. Then Arthur said the words that changed everything. "Margaret, I don't think Richard spent his final months preparing for death." The room suddenly felt colder. "What do you mean?" Arthur's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I think he was preparing for what would happen to you after he was gone. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized something far more frightening than grief itself. My husband may have known something about my family that I didn't. And whatever that truth was, it had already begun. I barely slept that night. Not because of grief. Grief had already become familiar. It sat beside me every day now. Quiet, heavy, predictable. What kept me awake was Arthur's final sentence. I think Richard was preparing for what would happen to you after he was gone. The words followed me through the darkness. At 2 a.m, I found myself standing in the kitchen wearing a cardigan over my nightgown, staring at the coffee maker. For 42 years, Richard had made the first pot every morning, even when he had the flu, even when he was exhausted, even during chemotherapy, especially during chemotherapy. He used to joke that coffee tasted better when someone loved you enough to make it. I reached automatically for his blue mug, then stopped. The mug sat exactly where I had left it on the drying rack. For several seconds, I simply looked at it. Then I made tea instead. The kitchen felt larger now, colder. The refrigerator hummed softly in the silence. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. I sat alone at the breakfast table and watched darkness settle over the backyard. Richard should have been sitting across from me, reading the newspaper, complaining about politicians, pretending not to steal bites from my toast. Instead, there was only an empty chair. I found myself staring at it so long that tears finally came. Not dramatic tears, not movie tears, just quiet ones. The kind that slide down your face before you realize you're crying. By morning, the house had already changed again. I heard movement upstairs before 7. Doors opening, footsteps, voices, then laughter. Laughter. 11 days after my husband's funeral, I sat very still. The sound wasn't cruel. Not exactly. But it felt wrong. Like hearing music in a hospital waiting room. When I finally walked downstairs, Vanessa was standing at the kitchen island speaking into her phone. Daniel sat nearby scrolling through emails. Neither noticed me immediately. That hurt more than either of them realized. When children are small, they notice everything about you. A scraped knee, a headache, a bad day. Then one day they become adults. And somehow they stop seeing you altogether. "Good morning," I said. Daniel looked up. "Oh, morning, Mom." "Just Mom." Quick. Distracted. His attention immediately returned to his screen. Vanessa ended her call. "Margaret." She smiled warmly. Too warmly. The kind of smile people wear when they want witnesses to think they're kind. "Did you sleep okay?" I studied her face. Perfect makeup. Perfect hair. Perfect sympathy. Everything about Vanessa always looked carefully arranged, including her emotions. I managed. "Good." She picked up a folder from the counter. "I've been working on a few practical things." Practical. That word again. Over the past week, I had learned that practical often meant something painful disguised as reasonable. She opened the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, schedules, property estimates. I recognized a photograph immediately. My stomach tightened. It was our house. My house. The home Richard and I spent 4 decades building together. "What is that?" I asked quietly. Vanessa glanced down. "Oh." She laughed lightly. "Nothing serious." That answer alone told me it was serious. Daniel finally looked up. "We were just discussing future maintenance costs." Future. Another dangerous word. Future usually meant a future that no longer included me. "I see." Vanessa slid the photograph back into the folder. Too quickly. Almost nervously. Then she changed the subject. "By the way, Friday's gathering is getting a wonderful response." I blinked. Gathering? The wine evening. For a moment, I genuinely forgot. Then I remembered. The networking party. Inside my home. 12 days after Richard's burial. "Oh." Vanessa smiled. "It'll be good for everyone." Good for everyone. Not once had anyone asked whether it would be good for me. Daniel stood. "I should get going." He grabbed his keys, his laptop, his travel mug, then headed toward the door. I followed him into the hallway. Not intentionally. Mothers simply do that. We keep trying to steal extra moments, even when our children stop noticing. "Daniel." He paused. "Yeah." For a second I saw the little boy he used to be. The boy who needed help tying his shoes. The boy who cried when his goldfish died. The boy who used to reach for my hand crossing parking lots. Then the moment vanished. What is it, Mom? I wanted to ask 100 things. Why are you avoiding me? Why do you seem relieved when I'm not around? Why didn't you stop Vanessa yesterday? Why does this house feel less like home every day? Instead, I said something much smaller. Have lunch today. He looked confused. What? You skipped dinner last night. Oh. A brief smile. I'll eat. Then he was gone. The front door closed. The silence afterward felt enormous. Vanessa immediately returned to her phone. I returned to Richard's study. It was becoming my refuge. The one room untouched by other people's plans. The one room still belonging to Richard. And maybe to me. I sat in his chair, opened one of his old notebooks, ran my fingers across his handwriting. Then something caught my attention. A framed photograph on the bookshelf. It looked slightly crooked. Richard hated crooked frames. I stood and adjusted it. That's when I noticed something else. A different photograph was missing. For several seconds, I simply stared. The empty space looked wrong. I knew exactly what had been there. A family picture from Daniel's college graduation. Richard. Me. Daniel. All smiling. All together. Now it was gone. I searched the shelf. Nothing. The desk. Nothing. The drawers. Nothing. Eventually I found it downstairs. Inside a cabinet. Behind several decorating magazines. Not broken. Not damaged. Just removed. Quietly. Casually. Like an object that no longer mattered. I sat holding the frame for a long time. Maybe it was accidental. Maybe. But deep down I knew better. Pictures tell stories. And someone was slowly changing the story this house told. That afternoon brought another small wound. One so minor most people would overlook it. I almost did. Almost. The mail arrived around 2. I gathered it from the front door. Utility bills. Advertisements. Catalogs. Then an invitation. Elegant cream paper. Gold lettering. Friday evening reception. Hosted by Daniel and Vanessa Holloway. I read it. Twice. Then a third time. Hosted by Daniel and Vanessa. Not the Holloway family. Not the homeowners. Not even a mention of me. My fingers tightened around the envelope. The reception was being held in my own house. And, according to the invitation, I apparently didn't exist. I carried the card into the kitchen. Vanessa was reviewing catering options. Vanessa. She looked up. Yes. I handed her the invitation. She glanced at it, then back at me. What about it? My name isn't on it. A brief pause. Tiny, barely visible. Then her smile returned. Oh. Another laugh. Light. Dismissive. It was just a design choice. Design choice. Interesting. The erasure of a person reduced to graphic design. I see. She relaxed immediately. She thought the conversation was over. Maybe she expected tears. Maybe anger. Instead, I simply placed the invitation on the counter and walked away. That seemed to bother her more. Because silence leaves room for conscience. And guilty people hate empty spaces. That evening I made dinner. Roast chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. One of Richard's favorite meals. Old habits survive longer than people do. At 6:30, Daniel finally came home. Exhausted. Distracted. Quiet. We sat down together. For a few minutes, everything felt almost normal. Then Vanessa arrived carrying her laptop. She sat down, opened it, and immediately began discussing Friday's guest list. During dinner, at the table Richard built with his own hands. The same table where we once spanned business talk. The same table where Daniel used to tell us about school. I watched as she spoke, and spoke, and spoke. Daniel nodded occasionally. Neither of them noticed that I had stopped eating. Neither noticed that Richard's chair sat empty. Neither noticed the silence growing around us. Finally, Vanessa looked up. Oh, she smiled. I forgot to mention something. My stomach tightened. What? We may need to use the formal dining room for additional seating Friday. The formal dining room. Richard's favorite room in the house. The room she wanted to redesign. The furniture arrangement isn't ideal. I set down my fork. What does that mean? Another smile. Always the smile. We moved a few things today. A few things. After dinner, I went to look. The room was spotless, beautiful, and unrecognizable. Richard's chair was gone. The chair where he sat every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every anniversary dinner. Gone. Not sold. Not donated. Just removed. Stored in the garage. As if it were an obstacle. I stood there staring at the empty space. The indentation remained in the rug. A perfect outline. Proof that something important had once belonged there. For the first time since Richard died, anger flickered beneath my grief. Not rage. Something colder. Clearer. Because suddenly I understood what Arthur had been trying to tell me. Nobody was forcing me out. Not yet. That would have been obvious. Instead it was happening inch by inch. Picture by picture. Invitation by invitation. Chair by chair. Memory by memory. Someone wasn't trying to remove me from the house. Someone was trying to remove my place inside it. And the most frightening part? I wasn't sure Daniel even saw it happening. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, lying beneath the familiar weight of my comforter, I forgot everything. Forgot the funeral. Forgot the will. Forgot the empty chair in the dining room. Forgot Richard was gone. Then reality returned. It always did. Quietly. Cruelly. Like cold water finding every crack in a foundation. The house was still dark when I walked downstairs. I carried Richard's blue mug with me. Not because I needed it. Because holding it made me feel less alone. Outside, a pale gray dawn settled over Westport. The hydrangeas along the back fence swayed gently in the morning breeze. Richard used to walk through the garden every morning before breakfast. Checking plants. Pulling weeds. Talking to flowers as though they were employees who needed encouragement. I smiled despite myself. Then the smile disappeared. Because I suddenly realized I could no longer remember the last thing he said to me. Not really. I remembered conversations. Hundreds of them. Thousands. But the very last one? The final ordinary sentence before hospitals took over everything? That memory was gone. The loss hit me so unexpectedly that I had to sit down. Grief worked that way. People imagine grief arrives all at once. It doesn't. It arrives in waves. Months. Years. Sometimes decades later. And each wave finds a new place to break you. By 8 o'clock, the house had come alive. Doors opening. Footsteps. Phone calls. Vanessa's voice carrying through hallways. Always moving. Always organizing. Always planning. As if stillness itself offended her. I was pouring tea when Daniel entered the kitchen. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His tie hung loosely around his neck. For the first time in days, he actually looked at me. Really looked. Morning, Mom. Morning. A brief silence followed. An awkward one. The kind that didn't exist when Richard was alive. Because Richard always knew how to bridge uncomfortable spaces. Daniel opened the refrigerator. Closed it. Opened it again. Then sighed. I watched him quietly. Something was bothering him. The question was whether it bothered him enough. Finally he spoke. Mom. I waited. He rubbed the back of his neck. A habit he'd inherited from his father. Vanessa means well. There it was. Not concern. Not an apology. A defense. For a moment, I simply stared into my tea. Steam curled upward between us. I didn't say she didn't. Daniel exhaled. Things have just been stressful. Stressful. Another word people use when they don't want to discuss what actually hurts. I know. He looked relieved. As though we had avoided something dangerous. Then he grabbed his briefcase. See you tonight. And left. The entire conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet somehow it left me feeling lonelier than before. Because I finally understood something. Daniel saw pieces of what was happening. He wasn't blind. He simply didn't want to look directly at it. That afternoon, another strange thing happened. A locksmith arrived. I noticed his van from the study window. At first, I assumed he had the wrong address. Then I watched him walk directly to the front door. Vanessa greeted him, smiling, holding a clipboard. My stomach tightened. I went downstairs immediately. The locksmith stood beside the entryway examining the electronic security panel. "What is this?"
I asked.
Vanessa turned.
Oh.
Again that little pause. That tiny interruption before every explanation. The security company recommended an update. The locksmith shifted awkwardly. He clearly sensed tension. An update. Just replacing access codes. My eyes moved from Vanessa to the keypad. Then back again. Replacing whose access codes? Another pause. Longer this time. Everyone's. Everyone. Interesting. Because nobody had mentioned it to me. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had informed me. The house where I had lived for 42 years. The house legally belonging to me. And I was learning about security changes at the same moment as the locksmith. The man cleared his throat. "I can come back later if..." "No." I smiled politely. "Please continue." Vanessa relaxed slightly. The locksmith looked unconvinced. Smart man. By evening, the new system was installed. Daniel came home late. As usual. He barely noticed. Or pretended not to. I couldn't tell anymore. That uncertainty hurt most. The following day brought something even smaller. And somehow more painful. I came downstairs around noon and discovered several family photographs missing from the hallway.
Not all of them.
Only certain ones. The older ones. Pictures featuring Richard and me. The early years. The years before Daniel married Vanessa. The years before everything became complicated. I found the photographs stacked neatly inside a storage box in the garage. Not damaged. Not discarded. Simply removed. Like old decorations after holiday. I stood there holding one particular picture. Richard and I on Cape Cod. Summer of 1987. Wind in my hair. His arm around my shoulders. The photograph still smelled faintly of dust and cardboard. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because of the picture. Because of what it represented. Memories don't disappear all at once. They disappear gradually. A photograph moved. A chair removed. A room redesigned. Eventually, a life begins looking like it never happened. That evening, Arthur called again. His timing was becoming unsettling. Almost as if he sensed things before I said them aloud. "How are you holding up?" I considered lying. Instead, I told the truth. I found family photographs in the garage today. Silence. Not surprised silence. Knowing silence. That frightened me. Arthur sighed softly. "Margaret." "What?" Richard documented more concerns than I initially realized.
He said straight.
What kind of concerns? Papers rustled on his end. He believed certain decisions were being made around him instead of with him. A chill moved through me, because that sounded familiar.
Panfeli familiar.
Arthur continued. Changes to company operations, property discussions, financial planning, household decisions. I closed my eyes. Household decisions. Like moving photographs. Like changing security codes. Like removing chairs. Tiny things. Until they weren't tiny anymore. Why didn't you tell me? My voice came out smaller than intended. Arthur answered gently. Because he thought he could fix it. The sentence broke my heart. Because it sounded exactly like Richard. Always protecting people. Always carrying burdens alone. Even at the end. After we hung up, I remained in the study for nearly an hour. Watching the backyard. Thinking. Remembering. Questioning. Eventually, I realized something disturbing. Every uncomfortable moment from the past few years suddenly looked different. Thanksgiving dinners Daniel canceled at the last minute. Family vacations we were never invited to. Holidays shortened because Vanessa had other commitments. The time Richard spent 3 weeks building a playhouse for his grandchildren, only for them to never visit. At the time, each event seemed isolated. Now they formed a pattern. A quiet pattern. A patient pattern. Like water wearing away stone. Then Friday arrived. The day of the reception. The day the house would officially stop feeling like a home. Preparations began before noon. Florists. Caterers.
Valet attendants.
Wine deliveries. The place looked more like a corporate event venue than the house, where my husband had died less than 2 weeks earlier. By 6 o'clock, guests began arriving. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Laughter drifted through open doors. Crystal glasses clinked. Expensive perfume filled the air. I stood upstairs in my bedroom looking down at the crowd through the window. A strange feeling settled over me. Not anger, not sadness. Recognition. I was becoming a guest inside my own life. Eventually, I went downstairs. The moment I entered the foyer, a woman I had never met smiled politely. "Oh." She extended her hand. "You must be Daniel's aunt." For a second, I thought I misheard her.
I'm sorry.
"The aunt from Boston." She laughed. "I heard so much about you."
Jeg ser det her.
Then slowly shook my head.
No.
Confusion crossed her face. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared. Perfect timing. Always perfect timing. She slipped between us effortlessly. "There you are, Margaret." Margaret. Not mom. Not family. Margaret. Like a distant acquaintance. The woman glanced between us. Still confused, Vanessa laughed lightly. "This is Richard's widow." Richard's widow. Not the homeowner. Not Daniel's mother. Not Margaret Holloway. Just Richard's widow. A title attached to a dead man. For one brief moment, something flickered across the stranger's face. Embarrassment. She realized what had happened. Vanessa quickly guided her away. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But the damage remained. Because humiliations don't need to be loud. Sometimes they're barely noticeable. A missing introduction. A forgotten name. A role quietly erased. I stood alone near the staircase, watching guests circulate through the house. Then I noticed something else. Something that made my stomach tighten. Near the fireplace stood a man I recognized. Not a friend. Not a neighbor. Not family. A corporate acquisitions specialist. Richard disliked him intensely. And yet here he was. At Vanessa's party. Inside my house. Holding a glass of wine. Talking business. For the first time, a thought entered my mind that I couldn't dismiss. Maybe this was never about redecorating. Maybe it was never about parties. Maybe Richard had seen something much bigger coming. And maybe I was only beginning to understand how much danger he thought his family was in. That night, long after the last guest left, I sat alone in Richard's study. The house had finally gone quiet. A deep kind of quiet. The kind that arrives after too much noise. Empty wine glasses still. Sat forgotten downstairs. A faint smell of perfume lingered in the hallway. The caterers had gone home. The laughter had disappeared. Only the memories remained. I sat in Richard's leather chair, with the lamp glowing softly beside me. The acquisition specialist's face kept replaying in my mind. I knew exactly who he was. Richard had mentioned him several times over the years. Never warmly. Never casually. The man specialized in buying family-owned companies and turning them into corporate assets. Richard used to call people like him professional scavengers. Not because they were criminals. Because they waited patiently for weakness. Then moved in. I stared out the study window. The backyard lay silent beneath moonlight. For a moment, I could almost hear Richard's voice. Not because I believed in ghosts. Because 42 years of marriage leaves echoes behind. And suddenly, I found myself remembering a conversation from nearly 3 years earlier. One I had completely forgotten. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it felt different. Everything felt different. It had been a Sunday afternoon. Late autumn. The trees behind the house were nearly bare. Richard and I had been cleaning leaves from the garden. He was wearing an old navy sweater with a hole near one sleeve. I had begged him to throw it away for years. He refused. It's still useful. That was Richard. Nothing wasted. Nothing discarded. Not objects. Not people. Not memories. I remembered standing beside him while he gathered leaves into large paper bags. Daniel and Vanessa had visited earlier that morning. The visit lasted less than an hour. Most of it involved Vanessa discussing business expansion, luxury developments, vacation properties, corporate partnerships, topics Richard usually enjoyed. But that day had been different. After they left, he remained unusually quiet. I finally asked what was wrong. He shrugged. Nothing.
A lie.
After 42 years, I knew every version of his lies. The protective ones. The embarrassed ones. The worried ones. This had been a worried lie. I waited. Eventually, he spoke. Do you ever get the feeling someone is always measuring things? I laughed. What does that mean? He tossed another bag of leaves onto the pile. People. What people? Another pause. Then, Vanessa. At the time, I rolled my eyes. Richard smiled, but not convincingly. She looks at everything like she's calculating value. I remember laughing. Actually laughing. Because it sounded ridiculous.
Pull even.
Vanessa was ambitious, organized, driven. None of those things were crimes. You're imagining things. Richard didn't argue. He rarely argued. Instead, he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. Maybe. Then he looked toward the house, toward the kitchen window, toward the life we built, and quietly added, I hope so. Back then, I thought the conversation ended there. Now I wasn't so sure. The memory lingered long after midnight, and once it surfaced, others followed. Small moments.
Teen moments.
Moments I had dismissed. Moments Richard apparently hadn't. I remembered Christmas dinner 2 years earlier. Richard was telling one of his favorite stories. The one about Daniel accidentally flooding a hotel bathroom during a family vacation when he was 8. Everyone had heard it 100 times. Richard knew that.
He told it anyway.
Because he loved watching people smile. Halfway through the story, Vanessa interrupted. Not rudely. Not obviously. That was never her style. She simply redirected the conversation.
Smoothly.
Effortlessly. Suddenly everyone was discussing investment opportunities. Nobody noticed Richard had stopped speaking. Nobody except me. And Richard. I remember the expression on his face afterward. A brief flicker. Gone almost immediately. At the time, I assumed I imagined it. Now I wondered. Another memory surfaced. Thanksgiving. 3 years ago. Richard spent weeks planning. The grandchildren were supposed to stay overnight. He bought board games, movies, hot chocolate supplies, everything they loved. The night before Thanksgiving, Vanessa called. The children couldn't come. Scheduling issues, travel fatigue, busy weekend. Reasonable explanations. Always reasonable. Richard never complained. Not once. But later that evening, I found him sitting alone in the playroom he built for them, looking at toys nobody used anymore. That image still hurt, because now I realized something. Richard wasn't grieving missed visits. He was grieving gradual distance. The kind that happens slowly enough nobody notices until it's already permanent. Around 1 a.m, I stood and walked toward the bookshelf. Hundreds of books lined the walls. Business books, history books, biographies, novels. Richard loved books. He believed every problem had already happened to someone else somewhere, and books helped you learn how they survived it. I ran my fingers along the shelves, then stopped. A small notebook sat tucked between 2 binders. Brown leather, worn edges. I recognized it immediately. Richard carried it everywhere. For years. The notebook contained observations, ideas, reminders. Nothing secret. At least that's what I always assumed. I pulled it free, then hesitated. Opening it felt strangely intimate. More intimate than reading a letter. Because letters are written for someone. Notebooks aren't. Eventually I opened it. Most entries were ordinary. Measurements, appointments, business notes, reminders to call suppliers. Then I reached an entry dated almost 18 months earlier. A single sentence. Written neatly. Underlined twice. Daniel no longer finishes his own thoughts when Vanessa is in the room. I stared. Read it again. Then again. A strange heaviness settled over me. The observation felt painfully accurate. Because I had seen it too. I just never named it. I turned another page. Several months later. Another note. Vanessa answers questions directed at Daniel. Another page. Richard Holloway must not become a guest in his own company. I froze. My heartbeat quickened. The room suddenly felt smaller. Not because of the notebook. because of what it revealed. Richard had been noticing things, documenting things, long before his illness became serious, long before Arthur's concerns, long before the will. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't grief. It wasn't hindsight. It was a pattern. And Richard had seen it developing. I continued reading, page after page. Not accusations, observations. Careful, measured, almost clinical, like a man trying desperately to determine whether his instincts were wrong. One entry made my chest tighten. Margaret still believes kindness fixes everything. I smiled sadly, because he wasn't entirely wrong. Another note appeared beneath it. God help her if I'm not here. The words blurred. For several seconds, I couldn't read. Tears filled my eyes. Not because Richard doubted me, because he loved me enough to worry. Even then, even while dying, the grandfather clock downstairs struck 2. The sound echoed through the house. I carefully closed the notebook. My hands trembled, not from fear, from realization. The story I believed about the past was changing,
Piece by piece.
memory by memory. And then another thought entered my mind, one that wouldn't leave. If Richard had noticed all this, if Arthur knew some of it, if the notebook confirmed it, then why was Daniel still pretending nothing was wrong? The question haunted me, because unlike Vanessa, my son wasn't calculating. He wasn't manipulative. He wasn't cruel, at least not intentionally, which meant one of two things. Either Daniel genuinely didn't see what was happening, or he saw it and lacked the courage to face it. Neither answer comforted me. The next morning brought another unpleasant surprise. I came downstairs expecting quiet. Instead, I found movers carrying furniture through the front door. For several seconds, I thought I was dreaming. Then I recognized one of the dining room chairs in a mover's hands. My heart dropped. What is happening? The man stopped immediately.
Confused.
Vanessa appeared from the hallway, clipboard in hand. Always the clipboard. Always the plans. Margaret. That careful smile again. We're just rearranging some things. Rearranging. Another harmless word. Another dangerous word. I looked around. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar. And for the first time since Richard's death, a thought formed clearly inside my mind. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't a difficult adjustment period. Someone was actively rewriting the structure of our family, and Richard had seen it coming long before I did. I just didn't know yet how far the rewriting had gone, or what Arthur was going to tell me next. The movers left just before noon. By the time their truck disappeared down the driveway, 3 more pieces of furniture had vanished from the house. Not sold, not donated, not discarded. Relocated. That was Vanessa's favorite word now. Relocated. As though memories were office supplies. As though 42 years of family history could be moved from room to room, without consequence. I stood alone in the foyer staring at the empty space where a walnut side table had once stood. Richard built that table himself. One winter, during a snowstorm. The finish wasn't perfect. One leg was slightly shorter than the others. He used to joke that the table had character. Now it was gone, stored somewhere in the garage, waiting for a future that apparently no longer included it. Or me. I was still standing there when the doorbell rang. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Lately, every unexpected visitor seemed to bring another unpleasant surprise. But something made me answer. When I opened the door, I found a woman standing on the porch. Late 60s. Silver hair. Navy blazer. Leather handbag. She looked familiar. It took me a second. Then I recognized her. Helen. The woman smiled sadly. Hello, Margaret. Helen Foster. Richard's executive assistant. For 27 years. Longer than some marriages. Longer than many careers. Helen knew Richard almost as well as I did. Maybe better in certain ways. She saw the version of him that existed when I wasn't around. The businessman. The leader. The man responsible for 200 employees. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. I immediately stepped aside.
Come in.
She entered slowly, taking in the house, the silence, the changes, The expression on her face told me she noticed more than she said. People who worked closely with Richard tended to be observant. Richard rewarded observation. Vanessa rewarded agreement. There was a difference. I led Helen into the kitchen. Coffee was already brewing. Within minutes, we sat across from one another at the breakfast table. For a while, neither of us spoke. Grief often works that way. The people who truly understand your loss don't rush to fill silence. Eventually, Helen looked toward the backyard. I still expect him to walk through that door. I swallowed. So do I. Another silence. Then she reached into her handbag. My pulse quickened. Something about the gesture felt deliberate. Helen removed a thick manila envelope and placed it carefully on the table. I stared at it. What is that? Helen folded her hands. Something Richard asked me to keep. Every muscle in my body tightened. When? About 6 months ago. 6 months. Long before the funeral. Long before Arthur's phone calls. Long before I realized anything was wrong. I looked down at the envelope. My name was written across the front. Not in Richard's handwriting. Helen's. I don't understand. She sighed. I don't think Richard understood everything either. That got my attention. What do you mean? Helen hesitated, choosing her words carefully, just as Richard always did. Then she leaned forward slightly. Margaret, do you remember when Richard started working from home more often? I nodded. After the treatments became harder. Partly. The answer surprised me. Helen noticed. There was another reason. I felt my stomach tighten. What reason? Helen glanced toward the doorway, lowered her voice, and said, he stopped trusting what was happening at the office. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't believe her, because part of me already did. Helen continued. Not everyone. Not most people. But certain decisions. Certain conversations. Certain financial recommendations. I remembered Arthur mentioning concerns. The notebook. The observations. The patterns. Suddenly, they no longer felt isolated. They were becoming pieces of the same picture. What kind of decisions? Helen looked uncomfortable. Things Richard never would have approved. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Outside, wind moved through the trees. A lawn sprinkler clicked somewhere in the distance. Life continued, even while mine seemed to be unraveling. Helen looked directly at me. Do you remember the Stamford warehouse? I nodded. Richard loved that property. It was one of the first major expansions of the company. A symbol of success. A proposal was made to sell it. I blinked. What? Twice. Richard never mentioned that. Not once. It was rejected both times. By Richard. Helen nodded, then added quietly. Not by everyone. The meaning landed immediately. Vanessa. Maybe Daniel. Maybe both. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. The envelope remained untouched between us. Neither of us looked away from it. Finally, I asked, why are you telling me this now? Helen's expression softened. Because beneath the professional exterior, she loved Richard too. In her own way. He was worried. The answer came instantly.
No hesitation. No uncertainty.
Just truth. He was worried about you. My eyes burned. I looked down before the tears could fall. He thought I was weak.
No.
Helen's voice became firmer. He thought you were kind. The distinction mattered. More than most people realize. Kindness and weakness are not the same thing. But manipulative people often confuse them. Or pretend to. Helen glanced upstairs, toward the part of the house Vanessa occupied. Richard believed some people mistook your kindness for permission. The sentence settled heavily between us, because it explained so much. The photographs, the invitations, the furniture, the security codes, all those tiny cuts, all those small humiliations. Each one depended on the assumption that I wouldn't object, that I would absorb the hurt quietly, the way I always had. Helen pushed the envelope slightly closer. You should read it. I stared at it, afraid, not of what it contained, of what it might confirm. Eventually I opened it. Inside were copies of emails, meeting notes, internal memos, Nothing dramatic at first glance. Then I saw a familiar name. Vanessa Holloway. Again, and again, and again. Page after page. Recommendations. Proposals. Expansion plans.
À cette discussion.
Most seemed ordinary, reasonable, professional, until patterns began emerging. The same patterns Richard documented. Push harder. Move faster. Sell sooner. Modernize. Restructure. Replace. Every proposal seemed to prioritize growth, efficiency, profit. None mentioned loyalty.
Tradition. People.
The things Richard valued most. Then I found one email. A short one. Only 3 sentences. My pulse quickened immediately. It had been sent nearly 8 months earlier. From Vanessa.
To an outside consultant.
The message read, Richard remains emotionally attached to several legacy assets. Daniel agrees changes will be easier after retirement. I read it twice, then a third time. The room became very quiet. Not because the sentence was shocking, because of how cold it felt, emotionally attached. As though Richard's life's work was an inconvenience. As though the company existed before him. As though he were merely standing in the way. Helen watched me carefully. You see it now. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. Yes. The saddest part? I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt ashamed. Ashamed that Richard carried this burden alone. Ashamed that I dismissed his concerns. Ashamed that I kept explaining away things he clearly saw. For years. The grandfather clock chimed 1 o'clock. Neither of us moved. Finally, Helen reached across the table. Touched my hand gently. Margaret. I looked up. For the first time all morning, her voice carried urgency. Not fear. Urgency. There's something else. The words immediately tightened every muscle in my body. What? Helen hesitated, then spoke carefully. Richard didn't believe the distancing from your family started after he got sick. A chill moved through me. What are you saying? Helen's eyes softened. Margaret. He believed it started years earlier. The room seemed to tilt slightly, because suddenly dozens of memories resurfaced. Missed holidays. Canceled visits. Forgotten invitations. Birthday dinners postponed. Grandchildren who somehow always seemed unavailable. Events that looked accidental. Individually. But together? Maybe not. Helen slowly stood, preparing to leave. But before she did, she looked directly at me and said something I would think about for the rest of the day. Richard once told me something. What? She picked up her handbag, moved toward the front door, then answered quietly. He said the most dangerous family betrayals aren't the loud ones. I followed her into the foyer. What did he mean? Helen stopped beside the doorway and gave me a sad smile.
The
loud betrayals hurt. She opened the door. The quiet ones rewrite your life while you're still living it. Then she left. I stood there long after her car disappeared, alone, holding the envelope, listening to the silence. And for the first time, a terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if Richard wasn't preparing me for a financial betrayal? What if he was preparing me for the realization that I'd been slowly removed from my own family for years, without ever noticing it? I spent most of Saturday alone in Richard's study, not reading, not watching television, not even thinking clearly, just sitting. The envelope Helen left lay open on the desk beside me. Sunlight moved slowly across the room throughout the afternoon. Shadows shifted. Hours passed, and memory after memory continued rising to the surface. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely begins with a single event. People want a dramatic moment, a shocking discovery, a clear line between before and after. Real life rarely works that way. Real betrayal often looks ordinary while it's happening. Only later do the pieces fit together. Only later do you realize the story changed years ago. I sat staring at the garden outside and found myself thinking about Emma's kindergarten graduation. 3 years earlier, I had purchased a new dress for the occasion. Nothing expensive, just something cheerful. Richard teased me for spending so much time choosing it. You look beautiful in all of them. I remember laughing. Then the night before the ceremony, Vanessa called. The school had changed the schedule. Earlier start time, limited seating, complicated parking. She suggested Richard, and I skip it. Don't worry, she'd said. We'll take pictures. At the time, it sounded reasonable. The next afternoon, I saw photographs online. Not after the ceremony. During it, there were plenty of seats, plenty of grandparents, plenty of room, just not for us. I hadn't thought about that day in years. Now it felt different, painfully different. Another memory surfaced. Daniel's birthday dinner. 2 years ago. I spent 6 hours cooking. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, his favorite lemon pie. Everything ready by 6. At 5:30, Vanessa called. Last-minute change of plans. A business dinner.
Important client.
Maybe next weekend. The food sat untouched. Richard and I ate leftovers for nearly a week. At the time, we laughed about it. Now I wondered, how many of those changes were really unavoidable? How many happened because someone quietly decided we weren't important enough? The question stayed with me all afternoon. By evening, I felt emotionally exhausted. Not because of one memory, because of dozens. Small exclusions, tiny disappointments, little moments I explained away, moments that now formed a pattern, a deliberate pattern. The front door opened shortly after 6. Voices echoed through the foyer. Daniel and Vanessa had returned. I remained upstairs, not hiding, listening. Sometimes people reveal more when they think you're elsewhere. The sound of their conversation drifted upward through the staircase. At first, I couldn't make out the words. Then certain phrases became clear. Market timing, property value, legal structure. I frowned. Property value? Legal structure? A moment later, Daniel's voice answered. Tired. Frustrated. I don't want to discuss this tonight. Silence. Then Vanessa.
Calm.
Controlled. Persistent. We can't keep delaying decisions. Another pause. My stomach tightened. Something about her tone felt familiar. Not aggressive. Not emotional. Transactional. As though she were discussing inventory rather than family. Footsteps moved toward the kitchen. Cabinets opened. Glasses clinked. Then everything became quiet again. I stayed where I was, watching the garden darken, waiting. Around 7:30, there was a knock on my study door. Daniel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. More exhausted than I'd ever seen him. Not physically. Emotionally. As though something inside him had been stretched too far. Can I come in? I nodded. He entered slowly. His eyes immediately moved toward Richard's chair. The notebook. The photographs. The room. Everything his father loved. A shadow crossed his face. I haven't been in here much.
No.
The answer came out softer than intended. Daniel lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked 12 years old again.
Guilty.
Uncertain.
Lost.
I miss him. The words surprised me. Not because they were untrue, because they were honest. For weeks, honesty had become rare. I know. Silence settled between us. The comfortable kind. The kind families used to have before everything became complicated. Then Daniel walked toward the bookshelf. His father's bookshelf. His hand rested briefly on one of Richard's biographies. And suddenly he laughed. Just once.
Asadlet.
What? He shook his head. Dad used to make me read these. I smiled despite myself. He made everyone read those. Daniel looked around the room, then quietly asked, "Do you think he was disappointed in me?" The question hit harder than anything else that day, because beneath all the confusion, all the avoidance, all the mistakes, there was still a son grieving his father. I considered the question carefully.
No.
Daniel looked unconvinced. He argued with me constantly near the end. He argued with everyone. A faint smile appeared, then vanished. The room grew quiet again. Eventually, Daniel sat across from me, the exact seat Richard used during long conversations. For a moment, the resemblance was almost painful. Then he said something unexpected.
Vanessa thinks I'm weak.
I blinked. The confession arrived so suddenly I almost missed it. What makes you say that? Daniel laughed bitterly. Because she tells me. My heart sank. He stared toward the window, not looking at me, not directly. She'd never do that. But I know. The honesty continued, slowly, painfully, like someone opening a door that had remained closed for years. I don't think I've made a decision by myself in a long time. The sentence echoed through the room. Richard's notebook flashed through my mind. Daniel no longer finishes his own thoughts when Vanessa is in the room. A chill moved through me, because Richard had seen it, long before either of us. Daniel rubbed his face.
I'm tired, Mom.
Not work tired, not grief tired, soul tired. I understood immediately, because I felt the same way. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then footsteps appeared in the hallway. Vanessa. The moment Daniel heard them, something changed. Not dramatically, subtly. His shoulders tightened. His expression shifted. The openness vanished. The door opened. There you are. Vanessa smiled. Perfect as always. I've been looking everywhere. Daniel immediately stood. The conversation ended.
Just like that.
Not because she demanded it. Because her presence changed the room. Changed him. Vanessa glanced between us. A brief pause. Then she smiled again. We should talk about tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word immediately bothered me.
Why?
Her expression remained pleasant. There's a realtor coming. The room went silent. A realtor. My heartbeat slowed. Not sped up.
Slowed.
The way it does when bad news finally confirms itself. What realtor? Vanessa answered as though the explanation were obvious. Just someone reviewing options. Options. Always options. Always plans. Always possibilities. Never permission. Never discussion. Never respect. Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately. He avoided my eyes. That told me everything. The meeting wasn't news to him. He already knew. Maybe not the details, but enough. I looked at my son, then at Vanessa, then back again. What options? Vanessa folded her hands. The house is large. No answer. Just a direction. A strategy. A setup. The maintenance costs are substantial. Still no answer. Future planning matters. There it was. Future planning. The phrase appeared again, like a warning bell, like a script repeated too often. I stood slowly. The room felt smaller now, colder. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I spoke without softening my words. This house is not a project. Silence. Vanessa's smile flickered. Only briefly, but I saw it. Daniel saw it too. This house, I continued quietly, is where my husband lived. Nobody spoke. The study seemed to hold its breath. For a second, I thought Vanessa might argue. Instead, she nodded politely. Too politely. Which worried me more. Because polite people with bad intentions are dangerous. They simply wait for a better moment. After they left, I remained standing beside Richard's desk. The house felt different again. Not because of what had been said. Because of what hadn't. No one denied the realtor was coming. No one apologized. No one asked what I wanted. And suddenly Arthur's warning returned. Richard wasn't preparing for his death. He was preparing for what happened after. I looked toward the blue mug resting beside the lamp. Then toward the garden. Then toward the closed door. A realtor. 11 days after the will reading. Less than 3 weeks after the funeral. The realization settled into my chest like stone. Vanessa wasn't trying to become part of Richard's legacy. She was trying to move beyond it. And if I didn't learn exactly what Richard discovered before he died, I might lose far more than a house. I might lose the last place in this family that still belonged to me. The realtor arrived at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning.
Of course she did.
People who sell expensive homes rarely arrive late, especially when the property sits on nearly 3 acres in one of Connecticut's most desirable neighborhoods. I was standing at the kitchen window when her black Mercedes turned into the driveway. The moment I saw it, something inside me hardened. Not anger. Not yet.
Clarity.
There is a point in every betrayal when confusion finally disappears. You stop asking whether something is happening. You begin asking how long it has been happening. The front door opened. Vanessa greeted the woman warmly,
Too warmly.
like an old friend. That told me this wasn't a spontaneous consultation. This had been planned. The realtor stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio. Elegant, professional, confident. She looked around the foyer with the trained eyes of someone evaluating value. Not memories. Not history. Value. I remained in the kitchen. Watching. Listening. Waiting. A few moments later, Daniel appeared. He looked miserable. That was the first thing I noticed. Not guilty. Not excited. Miserable. He poured himself coffee. Didn't drink it. Just stood there holding the mug. The same way people hold life preservers. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, I broke the silence. You knew. It wasn't a question. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Mom. You knew. His shoulders sagged. I knew she wanted a consultation.
Consultation.
Interesting word. Because no one consults a realtor about a house they aren't considering changing. Did you tell her to invite one?
No.
The answer came quickly. Honestly. Too quickly to be rehearsed. That mattered. Small truths still matter. Even inside bigger failures. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then voices drifted in from the foyer. Vanessa. The realtor. Laughter. Discussion. The sound felt inappropriate. Like music at a graveside. Then footsteps approached. Vanessa entered the kitchen smiling. The realtor followed. Margaret. There was that smile again. Always polished. Always prepared. We were just discussing possibilities. Possibilities. Another harmless word carrying sharp edges. The realtor extended her hand. Mrs. Holloway. I shook it politely. She seemed kind enough, which somehow made everything worse. Because I knew she had no idea what she was walking into. This is a beautiful property. Property. Not home. Not family house.
Property.
I smiled. My husband built most of it. The realtor nodded politely. Vanessa immediately redirected the conversation. The market has been very strong lately. There it was. The real conversation. Not grief. Not family. Market conditions. I watched the realtor's expression. Professional. Neutral. Careful. Then something unexpected happened. The woman glanced around the kitchen, looked at me, and asked, So, where are you planning to relocate? Silence. Absolute silence. My heartbeat slowed. Daniel froze. Vanessa's smile disappeared for a fraction of a second. Only a fraction, but enough. The realtor immediately realized something was wrong.
Her face changed.
She looked confused. I thought. Nobody rescued her. Nobody could. Because the damage had already been done. The question hung in the air. Where are you planning to relocate? Not if.
Where?
As though my departure had already been decided. As though everyone knew except me. The realtor looked genuinely embarrassed. I apologize. Her voice softened. I must have misunderstood.
No.
You didn't misunderstand. Someone informed you. Someone gave you that impression. Someone told a story that excluded me. I looked at Vanessa. She recovered quickly.
Too quickly.
Oh goodness. A nervous laugh. We've only discussed future possibilities. Future possibilities. Again. Always the same phrases. The same careful language. The same strategy. Never direct enough to challenge. Never innocent enough to trust. The realtor excused herself shortly afterward. Professional instincts. She sensed trouble. Good instincts. As soon as she stepped outside, the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The masks loosened. Daniel set his coffee down. Harder than necessary. What exactly did you tell her? Vanessa folded her arms. Nothing inappropriate. Then why did she think Mom was moving?
A pause.
Dangerous pauses always come before truth. Or partial truth. I mentioned long-term planning. Daniel laughed once. No humor in it. Just frustration. That's not an answer. For the first time since Richard died, I watched my son challenge his wife. Not dramatically. Not heroically. But genuinely. And Vanessa didn't like it. I could see it immediately.
Her posture changed.
The room changed. Everything changed. We need to be realistic. Her voice sharpened slightly.
About what?
Daniel asked. The future. There it was again. Future. 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 As though repeating the word often enough would make everyone surrender to her version of it. I quietly left the kitchen. Neither noticed. They were too focused on each other. For once, I walked upstairs, into Richard's study, closed the door,
and sat down.
My hands trembled slightly, not because of the realtor, because of the question. Where are you planning to relocate? The sentence hurt more than any insult, because it revealed how others already viewed me, not as part of the future, as part of the transition, a temporary obstacle, a detail to be managed. I stared at Richard's desk, the blue mug, the lamp, the notebook. Then my eyes settled on the second envelope, the one Arthur had mentioned, the one Richard instructed me to open if certain things happened. I had avoided it for days, maybe weeks, because part of me wasn't ready. Now I was. I carefully broke the seal. Inside were several documents, and one handwritten letter. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Margaret, if you are reading this, then events are progressing faster than I hoped. I stopped breathing. For a moment, Richard was in the room again. Not physically, but completely. His voice lived inside every line. I continued reading. You will be tempted to think this is about money. It isn't. You will be tempted to think this is about the company. It isn't. This is about belonging. The words blurred briefly. I blinked away tears. Then continued. When people stop seeing someone as part of the future, they begin making decisions without them. They move photographs, change rooms,
Alter Traditions.
replace conversations with announcements. By the time the larger betrayal arrives, the emotional betrayal has already happened. My chest tightened, because Richard wasn't describing business. He was describing my life. Every small humiliation, every exclusion, every forgotten invitation. He had seen it, all of it, long before I did. The letter continued. If Vanessa ever begins discussing this house as an asset rather than a home, there is something you need to know.
I setstrete.
The next paragraph changed everything. 3 years ago, I created a legal protection structure tied directly to the property and the company. Not because I expected betrayal, because I observed entitlement. Entitlement. Such a Richard word. Precise. Measured. Accurate. I continued reading. Arthur has the complete documents. Trust him. Not because he is my attorney. Because he is your friend. Then came the final paragraph. The one that left me staring at the page for several minutes. Margaret, if you discover that people are trying to remove your place in this family, do not fight for a seat at a table where you are no longer respected. Build a different table. Let them decide whether they deserve a place at yours. The study became very quiet. Outside, sunlight moved across the garden. Somewhere downstairs, I heard voices. Daniel, Vanessa, still arguing, still struggling, still trapped inside dynamics Richard recognized years ago. I carefully folded the letter, placed it beside the blue mug, and for the first time since the funeral, something shifted inside me. Not revenge, not anger, resolve.
Because
Richard had finally given me the one thing grief couldn't. Perspective. This was never about selling a house, never about furniture, never about photographs. It was about dignity. And once a woman realizes her dignity is being negotiated without her permission, everything changes. Downstairs, a door slammed. The sound echoed through the house. Then silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that appears just before the truth finally begins coming out. And deep down, I knew something else. The realtor's visit wasn't the crisis. It was only the first visible crack. The real collapse was still coming. Arthur Bennett asked me to meet him on Tuesday morning. Not at his office. Not at company headquarters. At a small waterfront cafe overlooking Long Island Sound. That alone told me the conversation mattered. Richard used to bring me there on Saturday mornings. The coffee was average. The pastries were overpriced. But the view made him happy. He liked places where water stretched farther than the eye could see. He said it reminded him how small most problems really were. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habit. Richard hated making people wait. The sky was clear. The harbor shimmered beneath the late morning sun. Sailboats drifted lazily in the distance. Everything looked peaceful, which felt unfair. My life seemed to be unraveling one careful thread at a time. Arthur arrived carrying a leather briefcase. The same briefcase he had carried for as long as I could remember.
He sat down.
Ordered coffee, then studied me quietly. You look tired. I smiled faintly. I am tired. Neither of us pretended otherwise. For a moment we simply watched the water. Then Arthur opened the briefcase. My pulse quickened. Inside sat several folders. Thick folders. The kind lawyers only carry when conversations become serious. I reviewed Richard's instructions again. The words immediately tightened something inside my chest. Arthur removed one folder, placed it between us. Margaret, before we continue, I need you to understand something. I nodded. This was never a last-minute decision. The statement surprised me. Arthur noticed. Richard didn't create these protections after his diagnosis. My heart sank. When Arthur looked directly at me. 3 years ago. 3 years. Not months. Years. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Because 3 years meant Richard had been worried for a very long time. Longer than I imagined. Longer than I wanted to believe. Arthur opened the folder. Several legal documents rested inside. Professional. Precise. Complicated. The sort of paperwork Richard always understood better than I did. Arthur slid one page toward me. The house. My eyes moved across the document. At first, the language meant very little. Then Arthur pointed to a specific section. Richard had established a family protection trust, one tied directly to both the property and portions of the company. I frowned. What does that mean? Arthur folded his hands. It means certain decisions cannot happen without your consent. A small wave of relief washed through me, then disappeared. Because another question immediately followed. Why did he do that? Arthur was quiet for several seconds. Long enough that I already knew the answer wouldn't be comforting. Because he believed pressure would eventually be applied. Pressure. Such a careful word. Such a lawyer's word. Richard would have chosen it deliberately. What kind of pressure? Arthur looked out toward the water. Then back at me. The kind designed to make someone leave voluntarily. My stomach tightened. Photographs. Furniture. Invitations. The realtor. The security codes. Suddenly none of it felt isolated anymore. Arthur continued. Richard believed nobody would force you out. The pause mattered. They would simply make staying uncomfortable. The sentence landed harder than I expected, because it described exactly what had been happening. Not one major betrayal. Hundreds of small ones. Tiny humiliations. Quiet exclusions. Enough to make a person feel unwanted inside their own home. Arthur sighed. Richard understood people. Especially ambitious people. I thought about Vanessa. About the smile she wore whenever she erased something. About how every decision arrived wrapped in concern. Concern for the future. Concern for practicality. Concern for efficiency. Always concern. Never compassion. Arthur pulled another document from the folder. This concerns company authority. I immediately tensed. Not because I cared about business. Because Vanessa did. And lately, wherever Vanessa's interests appeared, trouble followed. Arthur adjusted his glasses. Richard created a review mechanism. What kind of review? Independent oversight. The phrase sounded harmless. But Arthur's expression suggested otherwise. He wanted outside auditors involved if certain financial patterns continued. I remembered Helen's envelope. The emails. The proposals. The recommendations. Everything pushing toward faster growth. Faster change. Faster control. Arthur nodded slowly. As of yesterday, those reviews are active. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means questions are being asked. The answer felt deliberately vague. Lawyers do that. Richard used to joke that attorneys charged by the uncertainty. Arthur ignored my expression. Or pretended to. There is another reason I wanted to meet today. The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. What reason? For the first time all morning, Arthur looked genuinely troubled. Daniel contacted me. I blinked. Why? Arthur hesitated, then answered quietly. He asked for copies of several documents. The statement surprised me, not because Daniel lacked curiosity, because curiosity had been missing from him for years. What kind of documents? Arthur opened another folder. Historical approvals, property records, board recommendations. The list continued. My confusion grew. Why would Daniel want those? Arthur looked directly at me. I think your son has started asking questions. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The possibility felt almost fragile, like thin ice, dangerous to trust, yet impossible to ignore, because something had changed recently. I had seen it, the argument after the realtor visit, the discomfort, the hesitation, the cracks. Perhaps Richard's death had finally forced Daniel to notice things he spent years avoiding. Arthur leaned back. I can't discuss private conversations. Of course. But... He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Daniel sounded surprised. The statement lingered between us.
Surprised.
Not defensive. Not angry.
Surprised.
That mattered. A lot. Because guilty people rarely sound surprised when they discover problems. Only uninformed people do. For the first time in weeks, a small amount of hope appeared. Not certainty. Hope. Arthur closed the folders. The meeting should have ended there. But something else was bothering me. Something I couldn't stop thinking about. Arthur. He looked up. Yes. I hesitated. Then asked the question. Did Richard ever think Daniel was part of this? The silence that followed felt endless. Arthur looked toward the harbor. Toward the sailboats. Toward anything except me. When he finally answered, his voice was gentle.
No.
Relief flooded through me. Then he continued. He thought Daniel was being led. The relief faded, replaced by sadness. Because that answer felt true. Painfully true. Arthur gathered the folders. The meeting ended shortly afterward. But as we stood to leave, he stopped. Margaret. I turned. There is one more thing. My stomach immediately tightened. Arthur rarely saved things for the end unless they mattered. What is it? He looked unusually serious. The auditors found communication records. A chill moved through me. What kind of records? His answer changed everything. Conversations that Daniel was not included in. The world seemed to slow. What conversations? Arthur's expression darkened. Business discussions. Property discussions. Future planning discussions. The phrase hit me immediately. Future planning. Vanessa's favorite phrase. The same phrase she used about the house. The same phrase she used about Richard's company. The same phrase she used whenever she wanted something changed. Arthur lowered his voice. We don't have complete answers yet, but we have enough questions. I stood frozen beside the cafe entrance. The harbor disappeared. The boats disappeared. Even Arthur's voice seemed distant, because one realization suddenly became impossible to ignore. For months, maybe years, important conversations had been happening around Daniel. Not with him. Around him. Just as important decisions had been happening. Around me. Not with me. And for the first time, I wondered whether Vanessa had been isolating more than one person. Maybe I wasn't the only one slowly being removed from my own place in the family. Maybe Daniel was losing his place too. He just hadn't realized it yet. As I drove home, Richard's final advice kept echoing in my mind. When people stop seeing someone as part of the future, they begin making decisions without them. The terrifying part? I was no longer certain he had been talking only about me. And somewhere deep inside, I sensed the next truth waiting to emerge. One that might finally force Daniel to choose between comfort and reality. Something changed in Daniel after Arthur's meeting. At first, it was subtle. The kind of change most people would miss. But mothers notice things. Even when their children are 41 years old. Especially then. For years, Daniel moved through life with a certain passiveness. Not laziness. Not weakness. Just habit. If Vanessa suggested something, he usually agreed. If she made a decision, he adjusted. If she redirected a conversation, he followed. It had become so normal that neither of them seemed aware of it anymore. Now little cracks were appearing. Tiny pauses. Extra questions. Moments of hesitation. Nothing dramatic.
Yet.
But enough for me to notice. Enough for Vanessa to notice too. 3 days after my meeting with Arthur, I came downstairs just before breakfast and found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table. That alone was unusual. Normally, Vanessa joined him immediately. Like gravity. Like habit. Like ownership. But this morning he sat alone. Several folders rested beside his coffee. His laptop screen glowed softly. The moment he saw me, he quickly closed it. Not suspiciously. Embarrassed. As though he'd been caught doing something private. I pretended not to notice. Sometimes people reveal more when they aren't cornered. Morning. He looked tired. Again. Morning, Mom. The dark circles beneath his eyes seemed deeper than ever. For few moments we sat in silence. The old kind. Not uncomfortable. Just quiet. Then Daniel surprised me. When was the last time you went through Dad's old photo albums? I looked up. The question seemed random. Years ago. He nodded slowly, then stared into his coffee. Dad kept everything. I smiled faintly. Everything. Richard never threw memories away. Receipts from vacations. Birthday cards. Little notes. Photographs. The man documented life the way historians document civilizations. Daniel's expression softened. He always thought things mattered. The sentence lingered. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Like someone realizing something too late. Before I could answer, footsteps entered the kitchen. Vanessa. The atmosphere changed instantly. Daniel sat straighter. The folders disappeared into his briefcase. The moment closed. Vanessa kissed his cheek. Then noticed me. Good morning, Margaret. There it was again. Margaret. Not family. Not warmth. Just distance wrapped in politeness. I nodded. Vanessa immediately shifted attention toward Daniel. We still need to finalize Saturday. Saturday? Daniel frowned. What Saturday? For a brief moment, genuine confusion crossed his face. Then something else followed. Concern. Because Vanessa looked surprised too. Only briefly, but enough. The investors. Silence. Daniel blinked. What investors? Now my attention sharpened. Vanessa recovered quickly. The dinner. What dinner? The room became very still. The kind of stillness that arrives when two people suddenly realize they remember events differently. Vanessa laughed lightly.
Too lightly.
The dinner we discussed last week. Daniel didn't laugh. His eyes remained fixed on her. We never discussed a dinner. A pause. Longer than normal. Long enough to matter. Vanessa looked away first.
Teeny detail.
Huge meaning. Then she smiled. I must have confused it with another conversation. Another conversation. Interesting answer. Because normal people forget details. Manipulative people forget witnesses. The exchange lasted only seconds. But I saw something important. For the first time, Daniel looked unsettled. Not by me. Not by grief. By her. Later that afternoon, another humiliation arrived. One so small it would sound ridiculous to anyone outside the family. Which is exactly why it hurt. The caterers from Vanessa's previous event returned. Apparently another gathering was being planned.
Smaller.
More private. More exclusive. I was arranging flowers in the dining room when two workers entered carrying place settings. I stepped aside. One of them checked his seating chart, then looked at me politely. Excuse me. Yes. We're trying to locate Mrs. Holloway. For a second I thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't. I smiled gently. I am Mrs. Holloway. Confusion crossed his face. He immediately looked down at the chart, then back at me. Oh. A pause. Embarrassment.
Sorry.
His finger moved across the seating plan. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach tighten. There it was. Printed clearly. Daniel Holloway. Vanessa Holloway.
Guests.
Business associates. Friends.
Investors.
Every seat carefully labeled. Then, near the very end, Margaret. No last name. No family designation. No indication that I owned the house. No indication that I was Daniel's mother. No indication that I was Richard's widow. Just Margaret.
A guest.
Like everyone else. Maybe less. The caterer apologized again. But the damage wasn't his fault. He simply followed instructions. I watched him continue working, then quietly folded the seating chart and carried it upstairs. Not because I wanted evidence, because I needed to remind myself this was real. That evening, I placed the chart on Richard's desk, beside the notebook, beside the blue mug, beside everything else. The collection of small betrayals was growing, and patterns were becoming harder to ignore. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. Arthur. Again. The moment I answered, I sensed something had happened. Margaret. His tone was different. Careful. Measured. Lawyers only sound that careful when they dislike what they're about to say. What is it? A pause. Then, Daniel came to see me.
I setzt trete.
What happened? Arthur exhaled slowly. He requested authorization records. My heartbeat quickened. Why? Because several approvals contain his name. Another pause. Then the part that mattered. He doesn't remember approving them. The room suddenly felt colder. I stared at the garden outside. The late afternoon sun no longer seemed warm. What kind of approvals? Arthur's answer came quietly. Property discussions. Vendor changes. Investment recommendations. The same categories again. The same pattern. The same future planning. I gripped the arm of Richard's chair. Are you saying someone forged documents?
No.
The answer came immediately. Important. Definitive. Nothing suggests forgery. Then what? Arthur was silent. Too silent. Then, I think Daniel stopped paying attention. The honesty hurt, because it sounded true. Painfully true. Arthur continued. Margaret, some approvals were technically authorized, but not meaningfully reviewed. I closed my eyes. Richard's notebook flashed through my mind. Daniel no longer finishes his own thoughts when Vanessa is in the room. Suddenly the sentence felt even sadder. Not because Daniel was weak, because he had gradually stopped trusting himself. And when people stop trusting themselves, they start borrowing certainty from others. The wrong people love that. Before hanging up, Arthur said something unexpected. Your son is frightened. The statement surprised me. Why? Arthur answered softly. Because he's starting to realize how much happened without him noticing. After the call ended, I remained alone in the study, thinking, watching shadows move across the lawn, listening to the grandfather clock downstairs.
Tick, tick, tick.
Then another memory surfaced. Richard, 2 years earlier, standing beside the garden, watching Daniel and Vanessa leave after dinner. I remembered something he'd said. At the time, I dismissed it. Now I couldn't. What's wrong? I'd asked. Richard watched their car disappear, then answered quietly. The day a person stops questioning things. He paused, long enough for me to look up. Is the day someone else starts deciding their life for them. I hadn't understood him then. I understood him now. And somewhere in the house below me, Daniel was finally beginning to understand too. The terrifying part? Understanding usually comes before collapse, not after. And for the first time since the funeral, I had the unmistakable feeling that the fragile balance holding this family together was about to
break.
Not because of money, not because of the company, because truth was finally catching up with everyone, including my son. The confrontation began on a Thursday, not with shouting, not with accusations, not even with anger. It began with a question. And sometimes questions are more dangerous than accusations. Because questions demand answers. And answers have a way of exposing things people work very hard to hide. I was in the garden when it started. The afternoon sun hung low above the trees. A light breeze moved through the hydrangeas Richard planted 20 years earlier. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Not yet.
But peace.
My hands were covered in soil. I was trimming dead blooms when I heard voices through the open kitchen window. Daniel. Vanessa. At first, I ignored them. Married people argue. Grieving people argue. Families argue. But then I heard my name. And everything changed. Why wasn't she informed? Daniel's voice. Firm. Controlled. Different. I slowly lowered the pruning shears. Silence followed. Then Vanessa. What are you talking about? The answer arrived too quickly.
Too smoothly.
A practiced answer. The kind people give when they already know exactly what you're talking about. Daniel wasn't fooled. Neither was I. The property review. My stomach tightened. The property review. Another piece of the puzzle. Another conversation I hadn't been included in. The voices grew louder. Not screaming.
Sharper.
More honest. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't retreating. He was staying. That mattered. A lot. I quietly stepped away from the window. Not because I didn't want to hear. Because some conversations belong to the people having them. Even when they affect you. I returned to the garden. But the raised voices continued. Then a door slammed.
Hard.
A few minutes later, Daniel appeared outside. He didn't see me at first. He walked across the lawn toward the old oak tree near the fence. The same tree where Richard taught him to throw a baseball. The same tree where he built a treehouse when Daniel was 10. The same tree where Richard sat the day he received his diagnosis. Families leave footprints. Everywhere. Even after they're gone. Daniel sat heavily on the old wooden bench beneath the branches. For several minutes, he simply stared ahead. Then he noticed me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Eventually, I walked over and sat beside him, the way mothers have done for thousands of years. Quietly, without forcing conversation, without demanding explanations, just present. The silence lasted almost 5 minutes. Then Daniel spoke. I think Dad knew. The words came out softly, like a confession. I looked toward the garden. What did he know? Daniel laughed bitterly. Not because anything was funny, because some truths hurt too much to say plainly. I don't know. A pause. Then, but I think he knew something was wrong. The statement hung between us. Richard knew. Helen knew. Arthur knew. Now Daniel was beginning to know. The circle was slowly closing. What happened? I finally asked. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. Exhaustion radiated from him. Not physical exhaustion. The kind that comes when your understanding of reality begins changing. I reviewed the records. My heartbeat slowed. Not sped up.
Slowed.
The way it always did before difficult truths. What records? Everything Arthur gave me. He looked toward the house. Toward the kitchen window. Toward the life he'd built. Then quietly continued. There were meetings I don't remember. I said nothing. He wasn't finished. There were recommendations I approved without reading. Another pause. Longer. More painful. There were conversations happening around me. There it was. The realization. The one Richard recognized years ago. The one Daniel was finally seeing. The one that changes everything. Because manipulation isn't always about controlling people. Sometimes it's about convincing them they made their own decisions. Daniel stared at the grass. I thought I was involved. The sentence nearly broke my heart. Because he meant it. For years, he genuinely believed he was participating, leading, contributing, making choices. Now he wasn't so sure. And uncertainty is terrifying when it arrives after certainty. Especially certainty you've built your life around. The back door opened. Vanessa stepped outside. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The distance between them felt enormous. Not physical distance. Emotional distance. The kind that appears when trust begins cracking. Vanessa looked at Daniel. Then at me. Then back at Daniel. Her expression remained composed. But only barely. The control was slipping. I could see it. Daniel could too. We need to talk. Vanessa's voice sounded calm. Daniel stood.
No.
The answer shocked all three of us. Most of all Vanessa. Because she clearly wasn't used to hearing it. The silence that followed felt electric.
No.
Daniel met her eyes. And for the first time in this entire story, he didn't look away.
No. Simple. Direct.
Final. Vanessa folded her arms. A defensive gesture. Small. but revealing. You're overreacting. The moment the words left her mouth, I saw Daniel's expression change. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because overreacting is the favorite accusation of people who don't want accountability. Richard hated that word. He once told me, the easiest way to dismiss someone's feelings is to call them unreasonable. I suddenly wondered how many times Daniel had heard that phrase. How many times he'd accepted it. How many times he'd doubted himself because of it. Vanessa stepped closer. You're grieving. Another mistake. A bigger one. Because now she was explaining his emotions to him. Defining them. Controlling them. The same pattern. The same dynamic. The same strategy. Only now he could finally see it. Daniel shook his head slowly.
No.
The answer came immediately. Clear this time. I'm paying attention. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Because it wasn't about grief. Or documents. Or business. It was about awareness. Awareness changes power. And Vanessa knew it. For the first time since Richard died, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Real uncertainty. Not performance. Not calculation.
Fear.
Tiny. Brief. But real. Then she looked at me. A mistake. Because she expected support. Or silence. Or neutrality. Instead, she found something different. Observation. I wasn't helping Daniel. I wasn't attacking Vanessa. I was simply witnessing. And witnesses are dangerous.
Especially.
After years of pretending not to see, Vanessa returned inside without another word. The back door closed behind her. Daniel remained standing, breathing heavily. The confrontation wasn't finished. Not remotely. But something fundamental had shifted. For years, Vanessa had been the strongest voice in every room. Now someone else was speaking. And she didn't know how to handle it. That evening I made a decision. My first real decision since Richard died. Not about lawyers. Not about the company. Not about documents. About dignity. I walked through the house carrying a small box. Room by room. Photograph by photograph. I collected every family picture that had been removed. Every frame relocated to storage. Every memory quietly pushed aside. Then I brought them back. Not dramatically. Not as a statement. Simply as a correction. A wedding photograph returned to the hallway. A graduation picture returned to the bookshelf. A family portrait returned above the fireplace. One by one. Memory by memory. Place by place. By the time I finished, the house looked different. Not because anything new had been added. Because something important had been restored. When I stepped back to look at the living room, tears filled my eyes. Richard was everywhere again. Not physically, but visibly. His life mattered again. His story existed again. And so did mine. Around 9 o'clock, I found Daniel standing in the hallway, looking at one of the restored photographs. The Cape Cod picture. Summer of 1998. The three of us. Laughing.
Sunburned. Happy.
For a long moment, he simply stared. Then quietly said, I forgot that was there. The sentence hurt. Because he meant it. He genuinely forgot. Not the photograph. The life it represented. The family it represented. The version of himself that existed before everything became complicated. I stood beside him. Neither of us looked away from the picture. Finally, Daniel spoke again. A whisper. Barely audible. I think Dad was trying to warn me. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. And for the first time in years, I saw something returning. Not confidence. Not strength. Something more important. Self-awareness. The beginning of it. And deep down, I knew what came next. Because truth has momentum. Once it starts moving, it rarely stops. Sooner or later, Daniel would ask the question he'd avoided for years. Not what happened. Not who approved what. Not what Richard knew. The harder question. The one that destroys comfortable illusions. How long has this been happening? And when he finally asked it, everything would change. The truth arrived on a rainy Monday.
Fittingly.
Some revelations deserve bad weather. The sky had been gray since dawn. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. The kind of rain that makes the entire world feel quieter. More honest somehow. I was in Richard's study organizing old photographs when Daniel knocked. Not softly,
Not loudly.
urgently. The moment I saw his face, I knew something had happened. His complexion was pale. His eyes looked exhausted. Not tired. Shattered. He carried a folder beneath one arm. A thick folder. The same kind Arthur used. The same kind Richard trusted. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel entered, closed the door behind him,
And sat down.
the folder remained in his lap, untouched, like something dangerous. I immediately thought of Richard, because he used to do the same thing. Whenever he carried bad news, he always waited a moment before sharing it, as though giving people one last chance to remain ignorant. What happened? My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Daniel stared at the folder, then laughed. A short laugh. A painful one. The kind people make when reality becomes absurd. I found it. Every muscle in my body tightened. Found what? His eyes finally met mine. The missing piece. The room seemed to grow smaller. Outside, rain continued striking the windows.
Steady.
Relentless. Daniel opened the folder. Several documents slid onto Richard's desk. Emails, meeting summaries, property evaluations, communication records. Pages and pages of them. I recognized Arthur's notation immediately. What am I looking at? Daniel swallowed hard, then answered. The conversations. My stomach dropped. What conversations? His voice became very quiet. The ones that happened without me. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe.
Not.
Because I was surprised. Because part of me already knew.
Deep down.
The way people sometimes know storms are coming before clouds appear. Daniel pushed one document toward me. A printed email chain. The date stretched back nearly 2 years. 2 years. Long before Richard died. Long before the funeral. Long before the realtor. My eyes moved across the page. Then stopped. A familiar phrase appeared. Future planning. Again. And again. And again. The same phrase. The same language. The same strategy. The same careful positioning. But this time something was different. Daniel's name wasn't included. Not once. I looked up. Confused. Why wasn't he copied? The question escaped before I realized it. Daniel smiled bitterly. Exactly. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles into your bones. I continued reading. Property discussions. Company restructuring. Estate projections. Potential transitions. The language remained professional. Polite. Reasonable. But beneath it all sat one unmistakable message. Plans were being made. Major plans. And Daniel wasn't participating. He was being referenced. Discussed. Included as an outcome. Not as a decision maker. My hands began trembling. Not from fear. From understanding. I looked toward my son. He stared out the window. Rain reflected across the glass. I thought I was involved. The sentence came out barely above a whisper. I really believed I was. My heart broke. Not because Daniel was innocent. He wasn't. He ignored things. Avoided things. Accepted things he should have questioned. But this was different. This was manipulation. Careful. Patient. Long-term manipulation. The kind Richard recognized years earlier. Daniel rubbed his eyes. There were meetings I never attended. There were recommendations I never reviewed. There were conversations happening around me. Every sentence landed harder than the last, because Richard's notebook had predicted all of it. Years ago, the realization made the room feel haunted. Not by ghosts, by warnings. Ignored warnings. The rain intensified outside. The study darkened slightly. I switched on Richard's lamp. Warm yellow light filled the room. For a moment it felt like he was still there, listening, waiting, watching us finally catch up. Daniel opened another document. This one wasn't an email. It was a memorandum.
Short.
Professional.
Direct.
The date immediately caught my attention. 6 months before Richard's death. My pulse quickened. Then I saw the sentence. And everything changed. Future occupancy considerations following transitional estate events. I read it twice. Then a third time. My stomach turned. Occupancy. Not family. Not grief. Not widowhood. Occupancy. As though I were a tenant. As though my life inside this house were merely a logistical issue. I looked at Daniel. His eyes were filled with disbelief.
They were talking about you.
The words barely escaped him. They were planning around you. I couldn't answer. Because he was right. For years, I believed I was being forgotten, overlooked, excluded. Now I realized something worse. I wasn't forgotten. I was considered, studied, managed. The realization felt colder than any rejection. Daniel stood abruptly, crossed the room, then stopped beside the bookshelf. His father's bookshelf. The same place he stood weeks earlier. Only now something was different. The uncertainty was gone. Pain remained, but confusion had disappeared. Reality was becoming impossible to avoid. Finally he spoke. I confronted Vanessa. I looked up immediately. What happened? A long silence followed. Then, she said I was being emotional. Of course she did. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. When facts become difficult to deny, manipulators often attack emotions instead. Daniel continued. Then she said everything she did was for us. Another classic response. For us. For the family. For the future. The language never changed. Only the context. I remained silent, letting him continue. Then she said Dad never understood her. That one hurt, not because it surprised me, because Richard had tried so hard. For years. He wanted to understand. Wanted harmony. Wanted family. Daniel stared toward the window, then quietly added. And then she blamed you. The room became still. Completely still. What did she say?
His jaw tightened.
The answer clearly hurt him. She said you refused to move on. I closed my eyes. Not because I was devastated. Because I was tired. So tired. After everything. After Richard's illness. After the funeral. After all the small humiliations. My grief had become an inconvenience. A problem. An obstacle. Something to be managed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel walked back to Richard's desk. He picked up the blue mug, turned it slowly in his hands. The crack near the handle caught the light. Dad loved this stupid mug. I smiled through tears.
Yes, he did.
Another silence. Then Daniel whispered something that changed everything. I think she stopped seeing us as people. I looked at him. He continued staring at the mug. I think she started seeing us as positions. The sentence settled heavily between us. Because it explained everything. Richard wasn't a husband. He was control. I wasn't a mother. I was occupancy. Daniel wasn't a partner. He was access. Family became strategy. Relationships became leverage. Love became utility. And once people begin viewing others that way, nothing remains sacred. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the shoreline. The house seemed to hold its breath. Then Daniel looked directly at me. For the first time in years, really looked at me. Not as an obligation. Not as a grieving widow. Not as his mother. As a person. I'm sorry. The words nearly broke me. Not because they fixed anything. They didn't. Not because they erased the past. They couldn't. Because they were real. Finally real. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then I stood, walked toward him, and placed my hand on his shoulder. The way I had when he was a little boy. The way mothers do when words aren't enough. I know. That was all.
No speeches. No dramatic forgiveness.
Just truth. Because some wounds heal slowly. And some never heal completely. The rain continued falling. The clock downstairs continued ticking. Life continued moving forward. But something fundamental had changed. The illusion was gone. Completely gone. And once illusions disappear, decisions become unavoidable. Daniel knew it. I knew it. Even Vanessa probably knew it. The only question remaining was what would
happen next.
Because the truth was finally out. And truth has consequences. especially when it arrives years late, especially when it arrives inside a family. And deep down, I sensed one final chapter approaching. Not revenge, not victory, something harder, something more real. The moment everyone would have to live with what they had become. Vanessa moved out on a Friday. The irony wasn't lost on me. Friday had always been Richard's favorite day of the week. He used to call it the bridge between responsibility and freedom. For 42 years, Friday evenings meant dinner together. No business calls.
No meetings. No interruptions.
Just us. Now I stood at the study window watching movers load suitcases into a black SUV. The same driveway. The same house. A completely different life. The morning was cool for late June. Clouds drifted slowly across the Connecticut sky. The hydrangeas Richard planted were finally in full bloom. Soft blue. His favorite color. I held the blue mug in both hands. Not because I needed coffee. Because it reminded me that some things survive, even after being cracked. Down below, the movers worked quietly.
No shouting.
No drama. No scene. Real endings rarely look dramatic. Most happen in silence. A door closes. A car leaves. A room becomes empty. And suddenly a chapter is over. I watched as another suitcase disappeared into the vehicle. Then another. Then another. Part of me expected satisfaction, vindication, relief. Instead, I felt mostly sad. Because despite everything, this wasn't how any of us imagined the story ending. Not Richard. Not Daniel. Not even Vanessa, probably. Families don't fall apart all at once. They erode. One compromise. One avoidance. One ignored truth at a time. The study door opened softly behind me. Daniel. I didn't turn around immediately. I already knew it was him. Mothers always know. He stepped inside quietly. The way people enter churches. Or hospitals. Or rooms holding memories. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he walked beside me and looked out the window. The moving truck. The boxes. The life being dismantled. Everything was visible from here. She's gone.
His voice sounded strange.
Not relieved. Not devastated. Just tired. Deeply tired. I nodded. Yes. Silence settled between us. The comfortable kind. The kind we hadn't shared in years. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I keep replaying everything. I knew exactly what he meant. Every conversation. Every missed warning. Every moment that seemed insignificant until it wasn't. I do too.
He stared at the driveway.
I should have listened. The sentence hurt because it was true. Not because Richard needed obedience. Because he deserved attention. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. The old habit. Richard's habit. The resemblance still caught me off guard sometimes. Dad tried. Yes. He really tried. Yes. Another silence. The kind grief creates. The kind no advice can fix. Outside, one of the movers closed the rear door of the truck. The sound echoed across the property. Final.
Permanent.
Daniel watched it happen, then quietly asked, "Do you think he'll forgive me?" The question hung in the room. Heavy. Painful.
Honest.
I turned toward my son. Really looked at him. He seemed older now. Not physically. Emotionally. As though the last few weeks had forced him to grow in ways success never could. I considered the question carefully. Then answered. I think your father spent the last years of his life hoping you would find your way back to yourself. Daniel lowered his eyes. Tears appeared immediately. He didn't hide them. For once. He didn't look away.
Didn't change the subject. Didn't retreat.
He simply stood there, feeling the weight of everything. And somehow that felt like progress. Because accountability isn't punishment. It's awareness. And awareness is where healing begins. Eventually he nodded.
Small.
Almost invisible. But real. The movers left shortly before noon. The black SUV followed. The driveway grew quiet again.
No dramatic farewell. No final confrontation.
No grand speech. Just absence. Sometimes absence says enough. The house felt strange afterward. Not empty. Balanced. For the first time since Richard's death, The constant tension seemed gone, like pressure leaving a room. I walked downstairs slowly, room by room, the dining room, the kitchen, the foyer. Everywhere I looked, pieces of the house had returned. Photographs restored, furniture replaced, memories visible again. Not because I was living in the past, because the past deserved respect. The mahogany dining table stood exactly where Richard left it. His chair had returned. The indentations still marked the rug beneath. I touched the back of it gently, then smiled. Not a sad smile. Not entirely. Something softer. Something closer to gratitude. Later that afternoon, Arthur stopped by. He carried no folders, no legal documents,
No briefcase.
For the first time in months, he looked less like an attorney and more like an old friend. We sat on the back patio, overlooking the garden, the same place Richard loved most. Arthur accepted a cup of tea, served in the blue mug, my mug now, though I still thought of it as Richard's. We watched the breeze move through the hydrangeas. Then Arthur spoke. The board finalized everything. I nodded. The company would survive. The house would remain protected. The legal matters were settled. Important things. Necessary things. Yet they no longer felt central. Because Richard had been right all along. This was never about money. Arthur seemed to sense my thoughts. He worried about you. I smiled. I know. The answer felt different now. Warmer. Less painful. Because understanding had finally replaced confusion. Richard wasn't preparing me to win. He was preparing me to endure. To recognize manipulation. To protect my dignity. To survive reality without losing myself. That was his final gift. And suddenly it seemed far more valuable than any inheritance. Arthur left before sunset. The house grew quiet again. The good kind of quiet. Not loneliness.
Peace.
There is a difference. That evening, I carried my tea into Richard's study. Golden light filled the room. Outside, the garden glowed softly. The same garden we planted together. The same garden Vanessa once wanted redesigned. The same garden Richard loved. I sat in his chair. Opened the final letter one last time. The paper had begun softening at the folds from repeated reading. My eyes moved toward the final sentence. The sentence I knew by heart now. Protect your peace, Margaret. Some people only know how to love what they can take from others. I smiled, then folded the letter carefully, placed it inside the drawer, and closed it. Not because I was forgetting Richard, because I no longer needed instructions. For the first time since the funeral, I trusted myself again. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Daniel. He wasn't living elsewhere yet. Not completely. Life rarely changes overnight. But things were different. He came by often now. Sometimes for dinner. Sometimes for coffee. Sometimes simply to sit in the garden. Neither of us pretended everything was fixed. It wasn't. Trust doesn't heal in a month. Neither does grief. Some wounds remain. Some regrets remain. Some absences remain forever. Richard was still gone. Nothing would change that. No legal victory.
No revelación. No apology.
Nothing. That was the hardest truth of all. And yet, as I watched evenings settle across the property, I realized something. I was no longer afraid of the future. Not because the future looked easy. Because it belonged to me again. The house wasn't just protected. My place inside it was protected. My memories were protected. My dignity was protected. Most importantly, my sense of self was protected. For weeks, I thought the greatest betrayal was what Vanessa tried to take. I was wrong. The greatest danger was forgetting my own worth while she tried. And once I remembered it, everything changed. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed softly.
1, 2, 3.
The sound echoed through the house.
Warm. Familiar. Steady.
Like a heartbeat. Like home. I lifted the blue mug, looked out toward the garden, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like peace.